This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. Today is a day that we have been waiting for a very long time. We are going to take a look finally at Romans 13, verses 1 through 7. And this is probably the most politically infamous verse in the entire New Testament, maybe in the entire Bible. And for those of you guys that have been a long-time listener of the show, I know that at this point you are going to be very familiar with what Paul says in Romans 13. I'm going to read it here in just a minute for those of you guys that might not be as familiar with the Pauline literature, but this is the verse where the majority of debates around the consequences of Christian politics that result from a reading of the Bible are had. Like, this is the passage that people go to when they talk about the relationship between Christianity, the church, and politics, and we are finally going to address this on the show today. But this episode is actually kind of like the fourth part and a little bit of an impromptu or a loose four-part series. A while back, we took a look at Murray Rothbard's essay, The Anatomy of the State, and Murray Rothbard is a great libertarian economist and philosopher, and he wrote this book called really, it's not a book, it's more of an article. He writes this article called The Anatomy of the State, in which he defines what the state is. And so for Murray Rothbard, there are essentially two practices that make a state a state. And these two practices, or these two principles of statehood, are this. The first one is that the state is any entity that has a monopoly on violence in a given geographical area. In other words, the state is the organization that is allowed to use force and that determines or regulates the amount of force that other people can use in society, and that states generate their revenues through coercion instead of production. So instead of providing a good or a service that people purchase on the free market, the state is only able to generate revenue by taxing people or by taking money from them. And that on this show, we are going to be using Murray Rothbard's definition of the state as kind of a way of framing how we think about the state and how we think about the nature of state power. And I wanted to look at a couple of passages in the Bible where I think Murray Rothbard's conception of the state, it really plays out. And again, the point that I'm making here is not that the writers of the Bible are like proto-Rothbardians. And I'm not saying that you can find all of Rothbard's philosophy explicitly outlined in the Bible. I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that Murray Rothbard's definition of the state bears remarkable similarities to some of the concerns about the state and about state power that the writers of the Bible articulate. And so we looked in, I guess, the third of this informal four-part series at 1 Samuel 8, and we explored the problems of monarchy in the Old Testament. And we saw that God intended to rule over Israel as Israel's king, but Israel rejected, and this is what the narrative in 1 Samuel 8 is all about. Israel rejected God ruling over Israel as a king and instead demanded a human king so that they could be like the nations that surrounded them. And so God is going to explain to the prophet Samuel that there will be all kinds of problems that will result from Israel embracing a worldly monarchy, and that the problems that are outlined in 1 Samuel 8, again, correspond very closely to Rothbard's definition of the state, that it's going to result in an increase in violence and warfare within Israel and between Israel and its neighbors, and it's going to result in an unfair and unjust appropriation of people's property. And so the monarchy that is built into the Old Testament is going to reflect the ways that the concerns that Murray Rothbard has about the state, and it'll be articulated as such. And so eventually God is going to place limits on the kings of Israel, and he's going to wind up promising David, who is kind of like the high water mark for all of the kings of Israel, in 2 Samuel 7, that from the line of David there would one day arise a king who would wisely rule on behalf of God. And that promise is going to be ultimately fulfilled in Jesus. And this is the reason for the language that we attribute to Jesus, or that the writers of the New Testament attribute to Jesus, words like Messiah and Christ, and phrases like Son of God, or even Son of Man. All of these phrases refer to Jesus's messianic status, at least in some context. And so the fact that Jesus is the righteous, long-promised king is a fulfillment of this promise to David, and Jesus is the righteous king, and that means that all of the other people that claim to have sovereignty or that claim to kingship are making a false claim. Jesus is the true king, and we as his people should follow and obey him alone. So this leads us then directly to the problem of Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 7. And for those of you guys that are familiar with the Old Testament, you will know that the writers of the Old Testament are often very critical of the empires that surround Israel, and they call them out for their wickedness and their violence and their injustice. And the writers of the New Testament are very ambivalent, to say the least, towards Rome, while the writers of the New Testament are not openly politically antagonistic towards Rome in the sense that they're not calling for an open revolution, a violent revolution against Rome. The writers of the New Testament often do display dramatically this sense of discomfort or unease with the power that is attributed to the Romans by the Roman state. And a lot of the language that is used to refer to Jesus and the early church would have been in conflict with the language that the Romans used to refer to themselves in the first century. And if you've listened to episode 35 of the show where I had on Christoph Hellig, who wrote this amazing book called The Apostle and the Empire, Christoph Hellig in this book, he's a New Testament scholar who teaches in Basel in Switzerland. If you haven't listened to that episode, go back and do so. But he makes the claim in the book that Paul is very open in his criticism towards Rome, and that his criticism often is often a form of expressing discomfort or unease with the state of Rome, and that there are many places in Paul's letters and many linguistic categories and concepts that Paul uses in his letters that would have been perceived by a Roman audience as being in direct conflict with the Roman Empire. And so you have terms like Jesus being, or you have ideas like Jesus being crucified. You have terms like faith, which can mean allegiance in ancient Greece, in ancient Greek, and then even the idea that Jesus is the Messiah would have been seen or would have been perceived by a Roman audience as maybe not necessarily a direct threat to the Roman state. It's not necessarily a political threat to the Roman state, but definitely a relativization of the power of Rome. And so Hellig is going to argue very powerfully in this book that Paul is very open in expressing his unease and discomfort towards Rome, and that there was a potential that this could have gotten him in trouble. And so Romans 13 is addressed in Hellig's book, and he addresses it on the show. Again, if you haven't listened to that show yet, I would go back and listen to that. I think we start talking about Romans 13 right around the 41-minute mark, if you wanted to fast forward through and listen to that, because I essentially take Hellig's points seriously. I think that Hellig is onto something in his interpretation of Romans chapter 13. But given that Paul consistently expresses unease with the Roman Empire and that the writers of the Bible are consistently critical of the power of the nations, Romans 13 verses 1 through 7 really stand out. So I'm going to go ahead and read Romans 13, 1 through 7 for us so that we can frame the rest of this conversation. So Paul says this: "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority has opposed the ordinance of God, and they who have opposed will receive condemnation upon themselves. For rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil. Do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good, and you will have praise from the same. For it is a minister of God to you for good. But if you do what is evil, be afraid, for it does not bear the sword for nothing, for it is a minister of God, an avenger who brings wrath on the one who practices evil. Therefore it is necessary to be in subjection, not only because of wrath, but also for conscience's sake. For because of this you also pay taxes, for rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. Render to all what is due to them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor." So this is Paul in Romans 13, 1 through 7, making a lot of very provocative claims about the state and about the church's relationship to the state. The problem with this text is that this passage has been used to justify political violence and oppression throughout Christian history. And as I said before, it seems out of step both with the Bible's general skepticism towards the state and state power and Paul's own blatant confession in Romans chapter 1, as we're going to see in a minute. And elsewhere all throughout the New Testament that Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, and that Jesus is the rightful son of David. And in fact, the gospel is Paul's central message, and he defines the gospel at the very beginning of the letter to the Romans. And he says this in Romans chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. He says, Paul, a bondservant of Christ Jesus, called as an apostle, set apart for the gospel of God, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in the Holy Scriptures concerning his son, who was born of a descendant of David according to the flesh, who was declared the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead, according to the Spirit of holiness, Jesus Christ our Lord, through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles for his name's sake. So you have this really interesting juxtaposition in the letter to the Romans, where Paul says in verses 1 through 5, and all throughout the letter, and I really do feel like for Paul, the term Christ is a title that refers to his messianic status. And there's a really great New Testament scholar named Joshua Jipp who wrote a whole book on this called The Messianic Theology of the New Testament. And one of the central arguments in that book is that whenever we see Christ language in the New Testament, it does refer explicitly to Jesus' status as the long-promised Davidic king. And so we see we see Paul saying right at the beginning of Romans that Jesus is this king, but then at the towards the very end in Romans chapter 13, he seems to backtrack and say that all of the governing authorities are instituted and established by God, and that we should fear them, and that they exist because they exist in order to be a minister for good. All right, and so we have this tension there in the text. So Jesus as a king is fundamental to the beliefs of Christians. So what is it that Paul is doing when he says that everyone should be subject to the government? And again, for Paul, this isn't like the government in abstract. This is the Roman Empire that he's talking about. And he says that this Roman government is established by God, that they punish wrongdoing, and that they are servants of God. And this seems like on the surface that it contradicts everything that Paul believes about Jesus. And if you go back and listen to episode 35, like I said before, Hellig's main point on Romans 13, we talk about it for about 5 or 6 minutes there, is he says that Romans 13 is so it's so out of place characteristically with what Paul says throughout his letters and with Paul's stance of unease and discomfort towards Rome and the language that Paul often uses that would have been perceived by Paul's audience as being directly in conflict with the Roman Empire, that Paul can't just be laying out here the case that everyone needs to be obedient to the state and that everyone should unquestionably accept what the state does and that the state is necessarily a minister for good. One of the points that Heilig makes on that episode is that like Paul worships a crucified Messiah, that the Romans tortured and killed Jesus on a Roman cross. And so when Paul says that rulers are not a cause of fear for good behavior, but for evil, do you want to have no fear of authority? Do what is good and you will have praise from the same. Like what did he think about Jesus's crucifixion? Did Jesus do something wrong to get crucified? And of course, Heilig's answer is no. So Romans 13 has to be dealing with something that is bigger than just Paul's exhortation to the state. And so we are going to try to unwrap this text a little bit today and think about what Paul might have been doing in his context. And there's a really good article that was written a few years ago by a New Testament scholar named Neil Elliott. And the article is called Romans 13, 1 through 7 in the Context of Roman Imperial Propaganda. And this was written as a chapter in a compilation called Paul and Empire, which is edited by another New Testament scholar named Richard Horsley, who has done a lot of work on the relationship between the New Testament and then politics, or the way that political language is used in the New Testament. So Neil Elliott is a Bible scholar, and he's an Episcopal priest, and I think he lives in New Mexico, and a lot of his work deals with the political context of the New Testament. So in the first few sections of his article, he is going to outline the way in which Paul's rhetoric seems to contradict his teaching elsewhere in the New Testament, in the same way that Heilig is going to deal with that in his book, The Apostle and the Empire. And as we should always do when interpreting the Bible, Elliott addresses both the historical context of Romans, so what's actually going on in the first century history as Paul was writing Romans, what experiences did he think that his audience were going through, what's the historical background for the letter to the Romans, and we are also going to look at its narrative or rhetorical context. So given the backdrop into which Paul is writing, how does Paul outline his argument of Romans, and how does Romans chapter 13 contribute to the larger rhetorical goals of the book? And so we are going to begin looking at the historical context. And again, it's always very important to remember that the Apostle Paul had a very different understanding of the world than we do today. We as modern people have a completely different epistemological and intellectual understanding of reality than anyone living in the first century. And so not only does Paul understand what's going on with his audience, he also understands how his words and his language would have been perceived by those that would have heard him speak, and that would have been the recipients of Paul's letters. And the problem with interpreting Paul is that every single one of Paul's letters is occasional, meaning that Paul writes letters on particular occasions when he needs to address issues within particular churches. And so every single one of Paul's letters, and he's actually a very good communicator, and he didn't. He obviously wrote his letters, I think, through the mediation of a scribe. There are several points in the New Testament where the scribes kind of sign off to Paul's letters at the end. But Paul is a very effective communicator, and Paul is always going to gear his arguments towards the needs of the congregations to which he is writing. And a lot of the apparent contradictions that we see within the Pauline corpus, like a lot of the apparent contradictions that we see within Paul's letters, aren't actually contradictions. They are just the reflection of the fact that Paul has to say one thing to one church and he has to say something different to a different church. And again, he's trying to address the needs of these specific communities to which he is writing based on the problems or the questions that they have had for him. And it's very unfortunate that, with 1 Corinthians, we know that the letter, the letter in the New Testament, 1 Corinthians, was written in response to a letter that was written to Paul, but we don't have the original letter. So we have to historically reconstruct the background. So before we get into Romans and looking at the historical context of Romans, it is important to keep in mind that it's not out of line to think that while Paul might openly express his discomfort with the Roman Empire and other places, that there might very well be both historical and rhetorical reasons for Paul to write what he did in Romans chapter 13. And if you want to be a good interpreter of the Bible, if you believe that the Bible is authoritative, then you have to try to understand the Bible on its own terms. So I don't need, again, I'm not making the case, and I will never make the case that Paul is a libertarian, because he's not. He didn't think in those political categories. Those political categories did not exist in the ancient world. We're trying to reconstruct what Paul said to see how Romans 13, 1 through 7 makes sense within the larger within the larger world of Pauline thought within the first century. So the historical context of the letter to the Romans, it's really important to remember, and we've talked about this before, that the relationship between Jews who believe that Jesus is the Messiah and Gentiles who believe that Jesus is the Messiah is the most important problem faced by the early church. And one of the kind of overriding or meta questions that is being asked throughout the New Testament is, are Gentiles, people who are not Jewish, who believe in Jesus, required to follow the Jewish law? And so the Jewish law essentially functions within Second Temple Judaism, within the Judaism of Paul in the first century, as the boundary markers that define the people of God and the sign that those who follow them will be rescued when God comes back to restore his people. So the law functions, and Paul's going to use the phrase the works of the law, by which I think, and a lot of New Testament scholars think, that Paul refers specifically to things like practicing Sabbath, by having your children circumcised, by holding to certain dietary restrictions, that it's these practices that reflect a faithfulness to the law, and that by doing that, Jews are defining themselves from the pagan neighbors that are around them. And again, they're living in a world where they are expecting that God is going to, at some point, step into history and bring all of history to its intended destination. And there are various groups within Second Temple, first century Judaism that have various conceptions as to how God is going to do that. But there is a belief that if you practice the law and you are marked out from your pagan neighbors as being a part of the family of God, then that demonstrates in the present that you will be one of the people that God will rescue when he returns in his glory, when God comes back to restore his people. And this Jew-Gentile issue is often overlooked, but it is like the central theme in the book of Acts, in Romans, in Galatians, in Ephesians, and in Hebrews, and it's a subsidiary theme in many other works that are included in the New Testament. So what's going to replace this, and Paul's going to make this argument very eloquently in Romans and Ephesians and Galatians, is that faith, believing obedience in Jesus becomes the boundary that defines the church, and therefore Gentiles are not required to follow the law. So since the Messiah has come, and this is Paul's argument in Galatians chapter 3, and we see kind of this working out within the First Jerusalem Council in Acts chapter 15, but the argument is that yes, Jews are defined by the law. Now that the Messiah has come, both Jews and Gentiles are defined by their faith in Jesus, who is the Messiah, who is the King. Therefore, Gentiles are not required to follow the Jewish law. Now, Jews are free to follow the law if they want, but no one is in the right or justified before God on the basis of them following the Jewish law. And so if you're a non-Jew who puts your faith in Jesus, you are in the right before God, in the same way that if you are a Jew who does follow the law, if you put your faith in Jesus, then you are right before God. That righteousness, being in the right before God, is defined by faith in the Messiah and not by the works of the law. This is a really massive issue in the New Testament, and this is central to Paul's argument in Romans. Really, the first 11 chapters of Romans and even chapters 14 and 15 deal with this issue of the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. So what is it that's going on historically in Romans that would make this Jew-Gentile issue so prominent? So it's obviously very upfront and center within Romans. And what had happened before the letter to the Romans was written is that all of the Jews had been expelled or kicked out of Rome in 49 CE by the Roman Emperor Claudius. And this was due to unrest around the empire that had been attributed towards Jews who were exempt as non-citizens from paying a tribute tax, a privilege conferred by the first emperor of Rome, Augustus, to all Jews because of the support that he received from Herod the Great in his civil war against Mark Antony. So if you go back to the first century BCE, Herod the Great was going to support Augustus in the civil war against Mark Antony, and as an offering of thanks, Jews are going to be exempt from paying these tribute taxes and from paying temple taxes that would fund the pagan temples. And Jews had all kinds of other exemptions as well. But over the course of the first century CE, as more and more political unrest took place within Judea, this made more and more people within the Roman Empire suspicious of the Jews, and then also suspicious of the privileges that they had been receiving from the Roman government based on Augustus's favor to Herod the Great. So Neil Elliott in his article is going to outline this background here. I'm going to read a section of it because it's really important. So he says this: anti-Jewish violence was typically provoked not by religious differences, but by social pressures, especially the pressure of Roman exploitation and colonization that Hellenistic aristocracies deflected onto more vulnerable Jewish populations. Attacking the Romans directly was out of the question, but attacking Roman clients, i.e. the Jews, was not. Popular unrest occasioned by tax abuses might readily be deflected onto the Jews who, by virtue not least of their special privileges regarding the temple tax, would be all the more open to charges of tax evasion. The disastrous war in Alexandria in 38 to 41 CE, for so Claudius would later term it, fights between Jews and those that were around them, which had been fueled by native and Greek resentment of Jewish privileges, which Augustus had reaffirmed at the same moment he had imposed a capital tax on non-citizens. Although they had been harassed, rounded up out of their homes, herded together in the city and in the desert, tortured, even slaughtered by their Greek neighbors, Claudius apparently held the Jews chiefly responsible for the violence. He forbade the Jewish survivors from receiving Jews from Syria and threatened, if they disobey, I shall proceed against them as fomenting a common plague in the whole world. And so this is an example of how there were all kinds of problems between Jews and the Roman community, and that Claudius was responsible for fueling some of the anti-Jewish sentiment in the first century. So Claudius is going to die in the year 54, which is right around the time that Paul is going to write Romans. And his successor, Nero, is going to ascend to the throne in the year 54 as well. Nero is going to allow the Jews back into Rome. But the Roman church is in a really interesting state. Because of the edict of Claudius, because of Claudius kicking all the Jews out of Rome in 49, the Church of Rome had been run completely by Gentiles. So it was one of the first examples in all of history where you have a church of Jesus-believing people that is completely Gentile without any sort of Jewish involvement at all. And so the reintroduction of Jesus-believing Jews into the Roman church is going to cause tension within the Christian community. And again, we have to understand that the early Christians dealt with a lot of the same problems that we dealt with in the 21st century. So there might have been a lot of Gentile Christians that, based on the propaganda that Claudius was spreading at the time, that would have been skeptical of all of these Jews coming back into the Christian church in Rome. And it's very clear from what Paul says at the end of Romans, in Romans chapter 15, that Paul has not met the Roman church. He's never been to Rome before at the time that he wrote the letter to the Romans, but he planned on making his way to Spain and kind of wanted to use Rome as a base of operations for his missionary journeys in the Western Mediterranean. And so for Paul, understanding that this Jew-Gentile issue, which he had been dealing with for his entire time in ministry, is very explicitly outlined in the book of Acts and in Galatians. And I think Ephesians was written by Paul, and I think that he deals with that then. He knows that if he is going to have a relationship with the church in Rome, that he is going to have to address the Jew-Gentile issue. It's not an option for him to not address it. So that's the historical background for the book of Romans, and Elliot's going to outline some of that in his article too. I'd highly recommend looking this article up. If I can find it online, I'll try to post the PDF. If not, you might have to buy the book, but it's worth it. There are a lot of great articles in the book there. So that leads us then to the narrative context of Romans. So what is Paul trying to do rhetorically? Well, we call it narratival criticism when we look at one text in the New Testament, like Romans or Matthew or Revelation, and we try to see how it works as a self-contained literary unit. And so the rhetorical or the narrative context of Romans is that one of the many purposes for which Paul wrote Romans was to remind the predominantly Gentile church that the Jews were just as much a part of the community as the Gentiles. And as Paul will argue in Romans 1 and Romans 11, the Jews are only able to be a part of the Messianic community, the Gentiles are only able to be a part of the Messianic community because of the Jews. And as Paul is giving his great explanation of kind of his great thesis statement in the letter to the Romans, he says in Romans 1:16 and 17, "I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek." And he's also going to spend a lot of time talking in Romans chapter 11 about how the Jews are God's chosen people and the Gentiles were unnaturally grafted in. And so really the people of God, were historically the Jews, and because of God's grace, the Gentiles through faith are able to become a part of Abraham's family. And so the Gentiles that are in Rome need to understand their place, so to speak. And so Eliot's going to say in this article that Romans is designed to elicit Gentile solicitude towards the Jews. So it's a recognition that Jewish believers in Jesus and non-Jewish believers in Jesus are on the same team and they need to support each other. And so no matter what political propaganda the Gentile audience has heard about the Jews, no matter how superior the Gentiles might think, they have to support these Jewish believers in Jesus that are coming back into the church. And the other thing about Romans 13 that we have to acknowledge is that this passage is also going to occur in the parenetic or teaching section of Romans. Paul often includes moral or practical exhortation in the second half of his letters. It's really easy to see this, like in the letter to the Ephesians, for instance, and in Galatians, that Paul will spend 4 or 5 chapters or the first half of a letter explaining whatever it is he needs to explain to his community, and then he'll really dive in towards the end of his letters to the practical consequences of what he has been saying. So the first 11 chapters of Rome defines the church as those who have accepted the gospel with faith, and deals with the consequences of that reality, especially as it relates to the relationship between Jews and Gentiles. So again, the first 11 chapters of Romans is dedicated to this Jew-Gentile issue of making sure that his audience understands that the community, the family of God, is defined by faith in the Messiah and not by anything else. And again, this is all an attempt to make the Gentiles or to encourage the Gentiles to accept their Jewish brothers and sisters back into the community. And then, very obviously, in chapter 12 or in chapter 12, verse 1, he's going to turn his attention to instructing the church on how they ought to think and behave based on the first 11 chapters. So Romans 13, 1 through 7 is going to be an extension of his teachings in Romans 1 through 11. And another really great point that Christoph Hellig makes in his book, The Apostle and the Empire. If you haven't bought it yet, go ahead and go out and do that. But another great point that Hellig makes in there is that Paul is constantly in his letters. So if Paul openly expresses his unease towards the Roman Empire, Paul is constantly in his letters having to make the decision between being faithful to the proclamation of the gospel, saying that Jesus is the Messiah, even though that would definitely be heard by people in the Roman government as a threat or a supersession of imperial authority. He has to kind of strike this balance between being faithful to the consequences of the gospel and also making sure that the conditions are available for the gospel to continue being proclaimed. So Paul is very much aware, I think, that he sits on a precarious ledge. And as Heilig says in his book, too, there even in the earliest decades of the Jesus movement, it's still very likely that you could get in trouble by the Romans for believing in Jesus, that it would cause social pressures that might bring the state down upon you. And so Paul is constantly having to balance the truth of the gospel, where Jesus is the Messiah, with this realization that if they're not careful in the way that they present the gospel to the outside world, the Romans could easily come in and snuff out this new movement. And I think that Paul always has one look over his, or he's always kind of looking over his shoulder at the state when he makes these claims. So based on what we've said before, kind of looking at the historical and then the rhetorical setup of Romans, what are we going to do with this? So based on what we've said so far, how do we deal with Paul's apparently contradictory statements about the benevolence of the Roman imperial government in Romans 13, 1 through 7? So there's another really good book that I'm going to recommend to you guys by a thinker, a writer named Austin Rogers, and that book is called The Third Temptation. And in this book, it is going to demonstrate that the biblical perspective on government is compatible with libertarian philosophy. So the whole point of the book is he looks at the ways in which various writers of the Bible outline their kind of political theologies, or the way that they deal with political ideas within their text. And then he's going to compare that in the second half of the book to libertarian philosophy. It's a really great book. He's written a bunch of stuff for the Libertarian Christian Institute. And so if you haven't read it, I'd highly recommend going out and I'd highly recommend going out and buying it. And it's well worth the read for sure. He has a really great section on Romans 13:1, which discusses the problem of submitting to the government. And I want to read that from his book for you right now. It's a really great section here on Romans 13:1. And again, in Romans chapter 13:1, if you hear the pages in the background, I'm flipping through a lot of different texts right now. But Romans 13:1 says, "Every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God." Here's what Austin Rogers says about that in his book, The Third Temptation. He says, when Paul calls believers to be subject to the governing authorities, he is using a form of the Greek word hupotasso. Literally, the word refers to soldiers moving to the orders of their commander, but in non-military use, the word refers to a voluntary attitude of giving in, cooperating, assuming responsibility, and carrying a burden. The concept is about voluntarily yielding one's preferences to others. It's the same word used elsewhere in the New Testament for submit. Submit yourselves to God, says James 4:7. In Ephesians 5:21, Paul encourages believers to always be submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. He follows up the exhortation by telling wives to submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. Likewise, the author of Hebrews instructs believers about elders and pastors in the church. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will have to give an account. Clearly, the concept of hupotasso, as it is used in the New Testament, is about voluntarily voluntarily putting oneself under another and acknowledging their authority or dignity. It is done to serve the other, to promote the other's welfares or wants above one's own. Notice, however, that when the New Testament addresses believers' relationship to the government, the wording shifts. It says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities. Remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities. It's a quote from Titus 3:1. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. This is 1 Peter 2:13-14. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but for the sake of conscience. This is Romans 13:5. In the context of believers in the government, the verb hupatasso becomes passive, be subject, rather than active, submit to. What does this mean? So again, he's making the point here before I read this last section, is that the use of the verb that Paul is using when he talks about the relationship of Christians to the state is a passive verb. So you're not actively submitting to the state, you're just kind of passively being a subject to it. So fortunately, Paul gives, Austin Rogers goes on here, fortunately, Paul gives us the antithesis of being subject in the same passage of Romans 13 when he tells us that whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. The opposite of being in subjection, then, is resistance. Resistance is active, but subjection or submissiveness is passive. It need not be doing anything at all. It is rather a lack of doing something. Thus, being in subjection does not carry the same connotation of intentional service as does submission. Paul is not calling on us to be servants of the government or to promote its welfare and wants above our own. Rather, he is saying, don't resist the government, don't avoid your taxes, comply with the government as much as possible while remaining Christ-like. So again, this isn't an active participation for Rogers, and based on his interpretation of Romans 13:1. This is a passive. We are just going to accept the fact that we are going to be in subjection to the government. We're going to do what they ask us to as long as it does not come into conflict with our faith. And so Paul here is not encouraging his audience to either actively support or actively fight against the Roman Empire. They're simply to keep their head down and stay out of trouble. Another clue that this passage isn't as positive towards the Roman Empire as often suggested is found in the use of the word fear in 13:7. And so Elliot is going to explain this. Neil Elliott is going to explain this in his article on this. And so he talks about consciousness, fear, and the idle sword in this section. He's going to say that in talking about verses 13:7, Paul also warns against opposing the governing authorities, though he maintains a stolid stance about how or why such opposition might arise. He warns that the wrongdoer should fear the authority as the instrument of God's wrath, who does not bear the sword in vain. To conscience, then, is added the motive of fear or of wrath, so that Paul can at last conclude that both honor and fear are due to the authorities. The weight of these warnings threatens to sink more buoyant readers of the passage. Why should any decent citizen need to be exhorted to be subjected to the authorities who always reward the good? Why should fear of the authorities be urged from those who have just been told that they need have no fear if they do good? This last question is even more urgent when we observe that nowhere else in the New Testament or Jewish scripture is fear urged towards human authorities, being usually reserved for God alone. So what does this all mean then? And why does Paul use the language of fear at this point in his letter? And so what's going to happen is Eliot's going to continue this argument on further, and he's going to explain that based on his understanding of fear, that this demonstrates that Paul understands that the reality of the Pax Romana, the peace of the Romans, which is the foundation for all imperial propaganda from Augustus through Nero, was a lie. The fact that Paul, as a Jew writing to a predominantly Gentile church in Rome, had to point out that his audience needed to fear the governing authorities is itself an act of undermining the very peace that the Romans claimed to have brought to the world. The peace of Rome was maintained with the sword, which, as Eliot is going to point out in this article, will become the characteristic of Nero's reign, that the Romans are incredibly violent. And so, in other words, by saying this, Paul is making a counterclaim, and I think that his Roman audience would have been very aware of the echoes and the resonances of what Paul says, that the Pax Romana is a giant lie, that the Romans didn't actually bring peace to the world, and in fact, that imperial propaganda is only able to be reinforced by the power of the sword, which is why Paul's audience should have fear towards the governing authorities and why they should submit, not actively participate in submission, but passively submit to the government, because they will bear the sword against the church if they try to resist. And Eliot is going to tie this into an even longer Jewish tradition, which is very clearly articulated in Paul's time by the great Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, of what Eliot is going to call political realism. And so for Eliot, he does a short dive into the history of this concept of political realism within Second Temple Judaism. Eliot is going to say that the state for Jews is not at all inevitable, and that God will eventually put an end to all state power. Again, the idea within Second Temple Judaism is that God will one day come to judge the nations and restore Israel. And so eventually all of these powers are going to come to an end. But in the meantime, Jews are to support the state when possible and criticize the state when it is safe to do so. And Paul is most likely doing the same thing here, that if Paul sees that there is a conflict between himself and the state, then he needs to address that conflict. But if it is possible to be passively accepting of the powers that be, then they also need to do that as well. This goes back to Hellig's dichotomy of Paul saying what is necessary for Paul to say to maintain the truth of the gospel, while also making sure that he's at least rhetorically respectful enough towards the authorities that the preaching of the gospel is still possible. And there was a long and venerable tradition within Judaism of Jews doing this very same thing, knowing that God was going to come back one day and rescue his people and restore his people, but also realizing that in the meantime, that hasn't happened, and the powers that be will bear the sword. So Paul's use of the word fear here undermines Roman imperial propaganda, according to Eliot in his text. And heard from from a Christian perspective, that is, Romans 13 is much more critical of the state than it seems on the face of it. And I think it's really important to remember the historical situation that the Christians in Rome would have found themselves in. So there's another really good book that I've talked about before, written by a New Testament scholar named Bruce Winter, and it's called After Paul Left Corinth. And so he is going to discuss a passage in 1 Corinthians. It's 1 Corinthians 11:10. And again, this book is an incredible social science commentary on 1 Corinthians, really kind of getting at the sociological context of the people that were living in Corinth at the time that Paul wrote his letter, and then kind of reading 1 Corinthians through that sociological analysis. But he's going to argue, based on 1 Corinthians 11:10, that the church should conform to conventional social practices because of the messengers. That's a phrase Paul is going to use in his writing, and the term is often translated as angels in most modern English translations of the New Testament. But in this context, the term messengers makes a lot more sense. And Bruce Winter is going to explain that groups that met in urban centers throughout the Roman Empire would often be visited by messengers, people that were sent either by Roman elites or by government officials to report back to their senders about the group. So when these Christian groups met, they were oftentimes meeting in the bottom floor of these large apartments. Often, if there was a member of the community that was involved in a trade or in a craft, they might have a craft room in the bottom floor of these apartments. They would have been open to the street, and so people would have come in and out, and those that were interested in what was going on in the churches might send messengers to these communities to see what was going on as these churches met. And Bruce Winter has a lot of historical evidence to prove that as well. Paul is very, very concerned that his churches are perceived as not being seditious or antisocial, and would obviously need to write Romans 13:1-7 in such a way that the casual observer would not pick up on the obvious undertones of skepticism that Paul builds into this passage. So again, in Romans 13:1-7, if you look at the fact that Christians are called to be passively in subjection to the governing authorities, and if they're also supposed to fear the governing authorities as well, this is in no way Paul Paul reaffirming the legitimacy of the Roman state. Paul is not saying that the Roman state actually brings peace to the world. Paul is not saying that Christians need to actively participate in the Roman state. Instead, Paul is undermining a lot of the foundations upon which imperial propaganda was built. And he's doing this in a way that, again, if someone was to walk in off of the streets and hear Romans being read, would not immediately raise concerns for these messengers or for these people that were coming in outside of the church. Again, a lot of Paul's language about Jesus being the Messiah, about him being crucified, about the allegiance that Christians are to have to him, all of this language would have put him directly in conflict with the Roman church. And so Paul wants to minimize that conflict as much as possible. Now, the New Testament scholar N.T. Wright, who we've talked about a lot on this show before, has a massive book on Paul called Paul and the Faithfulness of God. It's like 1,300 pages long. And he makes a really, really interesting point in his book on what is going on here in Romans chapter 13. And I want to read the section here for you so that you can understand his point, because I think that he is going to make the claim, and I think it's a correct claim, that when read from the proper perspective, taking all of the historical and kind of rhetorical considerations into effect that we've talked about on the show today, that Romans 13:1 is actually designed to put the human authorities in their place. And so N.T. Wright's going to say this. There are 2 points that emerge here of relevance for the question of Romans 13. First, as to the identity of the rulers, they clearly include all human authorities, from Caesar on his throne, giving himself divine status, right down to the lowliest local administrator. But precisely by including them in a much larger array of powers, this way of speaking thereby relativizes all such rulers. Every name that is invoked, in Eastern Asia Minor, there was one name in particular that was invoked in Paul's day, and he knew it, and so did his readers. Of course, by implicitly placing Caesar within a long list of other types of ruler and power, Paul is demoting him, cutting him down to size. Caesar is one of many, but this was itself a polemical point. In a world where an absolute monarch was busy drawing all other powers to himself, where statues and coins dressed him up as Zeus, Poseidon, or some other lofty Olympian, to place Caesar by implication as one among many was already a calculated snub. It is much the same, ironically, in view of the way the passage has often been read, Romans 13:1-7, when Caesar is being granted divine honors, to say that there is no authority except from God, and that those that exist have been put in place by God, is to deny the very claim that Caesar is making. The Creator, who has made humans in his image so that they might reflect his authority into the world, intends that there should be human authorities, but insists that they should hold office only at his behest and subject to his scrutiny. This is so far the classic Jewish position that we have outlined earlier, and that it corresponds to Eliot's position in his book. Second, we note what Paul is saying about these authorities, including the most powerful human ones. They are now, whether they know it or not, subject not only to the instituting and judging authority of the one God, but also to the rule of the Messiah. So again, making the claim in Romans 13:1 that the powers are put into place in subjection to God, being established by God, already demotes them from the theological claims that they make about themselves. Again, the Roman emperors by the time of Claudius were already openly saying that they were in some sense divine, and by Paul saying that they are themselves only instituted and established by God is a way of relativizing their power. So we've seen at several points in Romans 13:1-7 that Paul is actually undermining a lot of the political propaganda upon which Roman imperial ideology rests. And so this text isn't as neutral and affirming as the Roman state as it might first appear. And again, this fractured Jew and Gentile church to which Paul is writing is already dealing with enough problems. Paul is trying to, I think, from the start, make sure that there is no other issues that they are dealing with, that again, they can faithfully proclaim the gospel without facing the threat of being shut down by the Romans. So I want to read the very end of of Eliot's article here, he has a really great conclusion as he wraps up what he says about Romans 13, 1 through 7. And he says, against the keen eschatological tenor of his letters elsewhere, Paul's positive characterization of the governing authorities here appears a foreign body. Within the rhetorical structure of Romans, however, these remarks have an important function: to encourage submission for now to the authorities rather than desperate resistance, and thus to safeguard the most vulnerable around and among the Roman Christians, those Jews struggling to rebuild their shattered community in the wake of imperial violence. There is hope here in the diligence of the authorities for the common good, 13:6, as in the diligence of the Christians, 12:2, who pray, endure, share their food and their homes, stand with those who rejoice or mourn, make their way with those who have been humbled. There is also warning here against arrogance, presumption, the scapegoating of the weak and the vanquished, and warning against any disruptive action that could bring crashing down on the poor community of Israel the ominous storm clouds of imperial power overhead. Only the most pernicious twists of fate would later enlist these verses in the service of empire itself. So Romans 13, when seen in its historical and narrative context, is completely consistent with the larger biblical critique of state power and the belief that Jesus is the Messiah, the righteous king promised to David who rules over the entire world. And this relativizes all claims to human power. This also shows that Murray Rothbard's definition of the state is, again, not derived from the Bible, but it's completely consistent with biblical teaching. Because of human pride and sin, the state will forever hold a monopoly on violence and oppress people by confiscating their property for the benefit of the state. And I think that the conclusion that we can draw from Romans 13 is that while we are called not to be actively, openly, violently resistant against the state, we have to be skeptical of state power. And again, Paul in Romans 13, on a close historical reading, betrays a large amount of skepticism towards the power of the Roman state. Politicians, whether on the right or the left, that promise to make America a better place using the implements of the state will always, always, always fail, and they will fail at the expense of the people over which they rule. We have an obligation to follow laws as long as they conform with our Christian principles, but we also have an obligation to relativize the power of the state. And as Christians, we should absolutely not put our hope in the state or actively encourage more state involvement in our personal lives. And I think this is completely consistent with Paul's teachings in Romans chapter 13. Again, far from being an affirmation or a rubber stamp of all state power, this is a very subtle and rhetorical way of Paul saying that we have to be respectful to the fact that there are these authorities in power and that they will bear the sword and that we should fear them, and that we also have to pay taxes or we might put ourselves in danger. But he undermines, again, this kind of theological authority upon which the state rests. And so to that end, it's important to remember that Romans chapter 13 is not a legitimation of the state. It's not a rubber stamp for everything that any state wants to do. And in fact, it undermines philosophically and theologically the foundational principles on which a lot of statehood rest. And I think the fact that we live in an era that has been shaped by the 20th century's idea of this kind of omnipotent scientific state, I think that we need this critique of statehood now more than ever. In Romans 13, if you think about it in its historical context, does a really great job of providing us both with the tools that we need as a church to live in a world where the state is going to be inevitable, but also it gives us the tools to critique and analyze the power of the state and the rhetoric that states use, including especially the United States of America and our political class. It gives us the tools we need to undermine the propaganda that is given by them, that these governments do not have omnipotent power and authority over our lives, and that these governments lie when they say that they bring us peace and prosperity. They do not, because they cannot. And then as Christians, we have to be passively accepting of the ruling class. This doesn't mean that we can't critique it when possible, and this doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to push for change. I think it's very, very important as Christians, especially in a freer society like the one that we live in now, that we're constantly advocating for change. I think that we also have to accept the fact that we're not going to be able to overthrow the government through a violent rebellion or a violent revolution, that in and of itself would be antithetical to our faith, and that Paul never would have imagined what it was like to be a Christian living in a world like the one that we have today. So we take the principles that Paul has outlined in Romans chapter 13, and we try to find ways to apply those to our social and our political context today, which means that we don't believe the propaganda that the state is supreme. As Christians, we know that the only person that we pledge our allegiance to is Christ, but also we have to find ways of living in passive submission or passive acceptance of the state insofar as our rebellion against the state or our critique of the state would compromise our witness to the gospel. Again, I think the most important thing that we have to do as Christians now, if we are going to be critical of the state, which people in an open society ought to be able to do, we have to do it in a way that does not compromise our ability to share the gospel. And again, it's the preaching of the gospel that really matters for the church. This is the thing that we are supposed to do. And in fact, I believe that if more and more people embrace the gospel that Jesus was the Messiah, then a lot of our social and political problems would solve themselves. And so when we think about how we engage the world politically as a church, when we think about the face that we put on as Christians, the political face, we have to make sure that we do so in a way that is both consistent with the worship of a crucified and risen Messiah, and do so in a way that does not compromise the values of our faith. I don't think this is going to be the last time that we're going to be talking about Romans 13. There's a lot more that could be said about this passage, and one day we might even do like a deep exegetical dive into the text, go word by word, line by line, really dive in based on the principles that we've outlined today. We really dive into what Paul is saying there, but I hope that the arguments that I've made on the show today, the historical and rhetorical arguments that I've made on the show, helps give you a better perspective on Romans 13, and that you can walk away from that passage feeling like you understand its place, not only within Romans, but within the Pauline corpus more generally, better than you did before you listened to the show. Again, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. I've been really excited to record this one for a long time. I hope that you guys learned a lot from it. If you have any more questions for me, you want to follow up on anything that we discussed in the show, as always, feel free to email me or hit me up on Twitter. Always there to respond to those of you guys that have great questions. So again, thanks for listening, and we will see you on Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.